Okay. Good morning, Les. How are you?
I'm very well, Christina.
This is Christina Zaman. I am with Les Hough, former director of the Southern Labor Archives at Georgia State University. Today is August 27th, 2020, and we are interviewing Les as part of our 50th anniversary oral history project. So welcome.
Thank you very much.
Les, can you start out telling us a little bit of background on the department prior to when you arrived?
I will. I think some of this you may already know and may have heard from others, but just to cover it briefly, it's my understanding that probably in 1970 or thereabouts, that labor historians, members of the history department at Georgia State, Merle Reed and Gary Fink, I'm not sure, I think it was Merle's, maybe it was his original idea. I think on one occasion or another, he had maybe even visited the Texas Labor Archives out in Arlington, Texas. I'm sure he was aware of Wayne State University's Reuther Library. So he became aware that there were various repositories around the country that focused on labor and working class documentation. And of course, he and Gary were very close, both well-published professional historians. And so they approached, I assume initially, probably whoever the head of the history department was at the time, not sure who that was, but I don't think it was either of them. Gary was later to be chairman, proposing that a labor repository focused primarily on Southern labor history be started. I'm sure that went through an approval process. I don't know many details about that. I do know, I think, that there was some connections already between leadership at the university, specifically Bill Suttles, who was the number 2 person at that point, the provost of the university. I think that he was acquainted with some members of the labor movement. I know specifically he was the pastor of Herb Green, who was a United Auto Workers official in the regional office in Atlanta. And that's actually one thing that I think relatively few current Atlantans are aware of. Atlanta was a major center for the auto industry at the time we're talking about. There were 3 different automobile assembly plants, in addition to various parts plants, warehousing facilities and the like, 2 General Motors plants and 1 Ford plant, all of which have since closed. So the labor movement was of greater size and significance to the community at that time. So Herb Green, who was one of the regional leaders of the United Auto Workers, had been a parishioner of Dr. Suttles, and I'm sure there were other connections. I don't know a lot of the details, but Bill Suttles was known for knowing who was who around the Atlanta metropolitan area and more broadly around the state. And of course, Noah Langdale was a legend in terms of his connections throughout the state. So Gary and Merle suggested, and it was approved. So the next year, of course, they identified David Gracie as the first archivist. David had already left by the time I arrived. I think I'd like to mention at least 2 or 3 other major labor leaders that I think had a significant influence on the beginnings of the labor archives. One was pretty much a direct connection to the civil rights movement in Atlanta. And there were actually a couple of people that I'd like to mention in that connection. One was E.T., and he went by Al. Everybody knew him as Al Kehrer, Kehrer. He was the Southern Regional Director of the AFL-CIO Civil Rights Department. Closely connected before Dr. King's death to Dr. King and SCLC and all of the major figures in the largely Atlanta-based American civil rights movement. He was white, but very well accepted, very close to many of those leaders. I'm sure he knew the late John Lewis very well and others. I'd also mentioned James Orange, who was also a regional AFL-CIO official, who had really, I think, gotten his start as a leader in the civil rights movement and then transitioned into the labor movement, but remained very, very closely connected with many of the leaders of the American civil rights movement. Both of them were strong supporters of the labor archives, including after I arrived in 1977. I would also mention E.L. Abercrombie, who was sort of the senior eminence in the labor movement at that time, already probably well into his 80s, was the head of the laundry workers in Atlanta. He was also white, but many of his members would have been African American, but was very highly regarded and thought of as sort of the gray eminence of the labor movement. And then finally, I would mention Joseph Jacobs, Joe Jacobs, who I got to know very, very well. I knew all of these people, but got to know Joe especially well. And he considered the labor archives very close to his heart, I think. He had been born in Birmingham, Alabama, and the son, I think, of a butcher, became a labor lawyer, in fact, the preeminent labor lawyer in Atlanta. And just to give you a sense of the time he was involved, I think he had just gotten out of law school in the early 1930s. There was a major labor strike, the textile strike of 1934, and Joe represented some of the strikers that were interned. I won't go in because of time. I won't go into great detail, but that is a whole story worthy of several hours of discussion itself. But Joe, from the 30s onward, from the establishment of the Wagner Act and other, major signposts of the labor movement's existence in the United States, he was there. He participated in all those things. So he had a depth of knowledge and a depth of reputation and so forth. And then, of course, was also very well connected politically. For a time was chairman of the Democratic Party in Fulton County in Atlanta. So certainly a major regional figure, both labor-wise and politically. I also, something I failed to mention when I talked briefly about Al Kehrer was, in a sense, maybe the resident intellectual in the labor movement. And he also had a very special attitude toward the labor movement. I think he had been a graduate of Yale University, just a real, someone that other labor leaders like Jacobs looked up to as being a real eminence in what the labor movement was trying to accomplish. All those people were involved and influential in the beginnings, and all of them continued to be involved into the time after I arrived in 1977.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue into my first question, which is when you were hired and what was your position and responsibilities?
Well, I was hired, I actually began work. I was interviewed, I think, early in 1977. At the time was at the Ohio Historical Society in Columbus, an archivist there, and was actually the director of something called the Ohio Labor History Project, which had only begun, by the way, just a year or thereabouts, and maybe a little more than a year prior to that. I had, of course, gone to graduate school at the University of Virginia, receiving my MA, and actually was still working on my dissertation when I first arrived at Georgia State and completed it later that year. Arrived in May and received the degree in August of that year. And both my thesis and dissertation were on topics related to labor issues. So that was really my first love, was what was, and still is, I think, often referred to as social history, sort of history from the bottom up, if you want to think of it in those terms, from sort of the common people rather than concentration on an elite. So that really is what had, I guess, recommended the people in Ohio to ask me to take that job, Ohio Labor History Project, and probably was the leading reason why I was interviewed and was chosen to head up the Southern Labor Archives. At that time, of course, the only other subject matter, if you wish, that the archives was involved with was university archives. Are you still there? Christina?
Yes, okay. Did you drop out or did I just drop out?
I'm not sure. And I'm not sure exactly when. The screen went blank.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, I think you froze and
okay.
the screen went blank. What I was talking about at that point was that the only other subject matter that the archives was involved with, other than labor, of course, was the university's archives. That whatever historical materials existed around campus were gradually brought into the same repository with the labor archives. So that's really how it all began. Of course, Ralph Russell was university librarian at that point. Carolyn Robison was his very good partner as associate university librarian. They were a great team, and it was just one of the great delights of my life to work with both of them.
So why did you decide to work at Georgia State, and what attracted you to this particular position?
Well, I mentioned the subject matter interest, that my leading interest, and that continues down to this very day, although just avocationally since I'm in retirement, was the history and the circumstances of American working class citizens, both their organizations like trade unions and their overall situation and the fate of their lives. Having headed up this project in Ohio, I had, because what we were doing was something similar, I guess, to what Dave Gracie was probably trying to do when he initially arrived, which is to establish relationships around In his case, the South. In my case, it was Ohio. And so what led me there was really the subject matter, but I think it would be a mistake to ignore the fact that Atlanta has been a very attractive place for many people to move to, especially as their jobs led them there, as mine did, and my family and I moved there. So it was a place that a lot of people, including people from outside the region, I came from the Midwest originally, found Atlanta a very pleasing place to live, a good place for both work and for family life as well. Should I go on, or do you want to have a specific follow-up question?
Well, my next follow-up question is, so once you arrived, what was Special Collections and the library like? And then if you want to go into what was Georgia State generally like, in terms of, size and structure and such.
Okay. Well, of course, my initial title, as far as I recall, was Director of the Southern Labor Archives and the University Archives. It was only later that I took on the title of Director of Special Collections as the department's purview widened, and we'll talk more about that later. I think one of the areas that I was prepared to talk about was sort of what specific tasks or responsibilities did I take on. And this was a gradual process. Obviously, at the very beginning, I was sort of just learning the ropes, learning what collections we had. And I think it would be mistaken not to give great credit to Dave Gracie. And of course, Bob Dinwiddie worked with David from close to the beginning. But the archives was very well organized and small. There were only 3 of us at the very beginning of my time there. Faye Gamble, and then Bob Dinwiddie, who I've already mentioned. Faye was sort of the office manager, and she did many things around the office, was, I think, in graduate school herself at that time in history. So although she was still learning, obviously, was a very capable young woman. Bob, who also had, I think, been in graduate school there at Georgia State, I think received a master's degree, if I remember correctly, in history from Georgia State. So both of them had graduate level training. It's interesting to note that neither of them, nor I, for that matter, to be fair, had ever had formal archival training in the sense of a degree program or something of that sort. It was really on the job training in Ohio, and then sort of teaching myself. To be frank, learning on the job was an important part of what I did. But the fact that Dave Gracie had sort of organized things, organized the collections with Bob's help, and one of the major things I wanted to do at the beginning was to build the collections. Although David had done, I think, a fine job over approximately a 5-year period to get things started, based on leads that he had provided or left behind, because we didn't overlap at all. I knew that there was a great deal more in terms of documentation of labor out around the southern United States, and eventually we began to gather it from other parts of the country as well. And of course, we never neglected to try to bring in university archives material either. We stayed in touch with both top leadership, and I would visit with Dr. Suttles and Dr. Langdale from time to to see about their papers, and then other officials at high but not as high levels to make sure that if they needed either records management advice or there was material that we appraised as being of significant long-term historical value, to bring that into the archives as well. But I followed up on, I think, just about all the leads that David had identified initially. That led us to many, many of the state labor federation offices around the South. And then people like Bill Ussery, I think we'll probably talk more about him later, who had just left as of January of the year I arrived. He had just left office as US Secretary of Labor under President Ford. So, and scanning through those possible leads and then creating some myself, I tried to identify what were the highest priority collections that might exist. And then I did a great deal of travel as well, to Montgomery, Alabama, or to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, or elsewhere, Richmond, Virginia, et cetera, to state AFL-CIO headquarters. One side bar, if you wish, we ended up also collecting the papers of various nurses associations on a statewide basis, which I think at least were part of the formation of the women's collection that eventually, there was not formally a women's collection while I was there, but we began to accumulate materials that included professions like nursing that were predominantly female in character. But I was doing lots of other things during those days, acquisitions being one of them, but I did not see my role as being even, not entirely, but I'm not sure even preponderantly custodial, the notion of simply storing records once they were acquired. I saw myself as that reaching out to the community out of which those records came and helping them to understand why what we did was important, and to even acquaint the wider community as to why labor had played a significant role. So what I termed at the time outreach, I think was a very important part of what we tried to do. And we did that in a number of ways, including major exhibits that we staged on campus and off. We did speaking engagements to various organizations to try to acquaint them with, and this, in the case of labor, this was often with labor organizations. So I'd speak, for example, at a state AFL-CIO convention, for example, or there are also local central bodies. These are labor organizations centered on a metropolitan area. So I'd go meet with the Richmond, Virginia AFL-CIO office or something of that sort. So I tended to think of it as sort of a two-way street, that in reaching out to them, I was also learning from them, as well as acquainting them with what we were trying to accomplish, and why we thought that what they had accomplished was important. As time went on, it was already obvious in what I've said earlier. We developed and continued to develop a close working relationship with the history department at Georgia State. And so eventually, this was not immediate, but within the first few years after I arrived, I actually started teaching in the history department. most of what I taught was a curriculum in archival administration, and we actually created a master's concentration in that. So you could actually receive from the history department a master's degree, obviously with lots of other coursework too, but that we thought, we hoped, our aim was to make people in a position to then pursue archival careers after that. Of course, the labor studies program was also created on campus at that time. I'm talking about the first few years I was there. And I taught in it as well. But since I was on a 12-month contract, 40-hour week, most of that teaching went on after regular working hours. So I spent a lot of evenings and whatever pursuing these other activities. And then I also tried to be as involved as I could in research and writing. So I published a fair number of articles in American Archivist, in the Georgia Archivist, that you may be acquainted with, now called Provenance, I think. So I tried to publish as widely as I could. And then I actually published by sponsorship some other pamphlet or booklet type work, including one for the sheet metal workers in Atlanta about their history, and then work with other organizations as well, including the Clayton County Water Authority. So I was, and I think in a standard way of looking at faculty work, that would fall well under the title of public service, trying to show that we could be of help to both private and public entities like a water authority or a particular union or something of that sort. We also sponsored, with the help of the history department, of course, jointly managed the Southern Labor History and eventually Southern Labor Studies conferences for a number of years. We did those every 2 years. And I had actually attended the very first of those when I was in Ohio, the Southern Labor History Conference in 1976. And then we sponsored another in 78. And then I co-edited the proceedings of that with Merle and Gary. So I was pretty busy with these various activities. And that maybe transitions into the issue of sort of how the purview of the department began to expand. If you want me to move on to that, or if you have a follow-up question.
Yeah, I have a follow-up just real quick. So Les, you mentioned all these academic extracurricular activities, but if I'm not mistaken, at the time that you were there, you were tenured faculty, correct?
I was tenured and eventually was promoted to associate and then full professor with tenure, yes.
And so those activities played a role in you kind of moving up the ranks. Is that correct?
Exactly. There was an understanding, I think, that if you sought to move up an academic rank, you were expected to undertake appropriate levels of research. And I wouldn't compare what I did, even though my dissertation was published as a book and some things of that sort. I wouldn't compare necessarily the level of research activity to that of some of the faculty. Obviously, for some of them, especially the more senior faculty, that's maybe the primary thing they do. They may do some teaching, but they often spend the bulk of their time on research. That was not possible given what else we were trying to accomplish at that time. But yes, and I might actually add a little coda to that. The issue of faculty status for librarians became a controversial issue. And I was trying to remember who the name of the provost, the name of the academic vice president at the time, and it escapes me. You could look it up. And maybe I should have. I just didn't get to that before our conversation. But the provost, the academic vice president, proposed that faculty status and tenure be removed from library faculty entirely. And we had discussions within the library faculty, and I think there were a few, who actually thought, well, maybe that would then take the pressure off of needing to do research or public service or any of the other responsibilities more traditional to faculty. But and I think easily a significant majority of the library faculty, saw that as sort of a lose-lose proposition, in the sense that giving those possible opportunities to library faculty was the most effective way at actually, in candor, limited cost, because there was no automatic upping in pay based on academic rank. I mean, there tended to be some correlation, but it wasn't a strong correlation. Full professors in the library didn't make anything like typically what full professors in some other departments would make. But I just saw that as sort of taking away an incentive for me and for others to be their best, to achieve at the highest possible level. And obviously, I didn't think people ought to be discharged if they chose to simply stay assistant professors or instructors, whatever, when they were hired. I didn't think that should be, it shouldn't be up or out, but I thought that keeping that as an incentive for high levels of achievement, and within special collections, I thought that would have a damaging effect in terms of, I thought that the people we were trying to hire would have some significant academic background and would find faculty status and the possibility of tenure and increase in academic rank would be an advantage even in terms of recruiting the very best people. We were able to win that battle. I would give myself less credit, even though I took probably a leading role in that, less credit to me than probably to Ralph and Carolyn, that they had such high standing, I think, in the university that we were successful in getting that avoided, at least as long as I was there. I think later there were changes made, but so that's a factor, I think. As far as, did you have another follow-up, or should I move on to the broadening of the?
Yeah, so if you want to go ahead on with what Georgia State more broadly was like, I believe that's the next question.
Okay. Well, obviously at the very beginnings, as I mentioned earlier, Special Collections was a very small organization with just 3 of us, and had a very small physical footprint as well. We had, I think it was maybe a third to a half of the 10th floor of the Urban Life building, which is a pretty small footprint. I couldn't tell you what it was in square footage, but it was not large. The stack area was not large and was not full when I arrived. I mean, there were, probably hundreds of Hollinger boxes, whatever, archival quality boxes of material, but nothing like there were later, of course. The library itself, of course, was only the library north building. Library South had not been built. It was significantly smaller in holdings. We didn't reach the 1 million volume mark until several years after I arrived. And I might just mention that Ralph came to me and said, what do you think our 1 millionth volume should be in the university library? And given that Georgia State had started as a business school, I thought that Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, perhaps the seminal work of capitalism, in a sense, of the establishment work of capitalism, would be a good choice. And so we were able to identify a first edition of that book from the late 18th century. And that, I think, is still part of the rare books collection. And I think that the rare books collection may have been the very next part added to special collections. It had actually been housed prior to that in Library South, I'm sorry, Library North. Yes, Library North, but was moved into our stack area. And also, a number of these things happened in the early 80s, and I don't have the documentation for exactly when they happened. Hopefully there's a record there of that. But by the early 80s, so I'd been there maybe 3-4 years, something like that, we began to run out of stack space. So we were able to negotiate the move of the entire department from the Urban Life building to what was then called Alumni Hall. And so we moved into the lowest level of Alumni Hall. About that same time, we were given a lead to the Mercer collection in California. And I can take you through that if you want me to at this point, sort of how that
Yeah,
came.
could you, yeah, if you could expand a little more on that.
Okay. Well, Ralph and I were approached by Bill Suttles, who, again, the provost and executive vice president, academic vice president for the university, #2 person. We were approached about the possibility of acquiring the Mercer papers. And in that conversation, it came out that the dean of the business college, I think already by then retired from that position, still, I think, on the faculty, George Manners was his name, had been the longtime dean of the business school, very distinguished, highly respected business professor and dean. He had been approached by his brother, same family, but different last name. His brother was mayor of Savannah, Georgia, which of course is where Johnny Mercer had been born and raised. And Nick Mamalakis was his name. And he was also close to the surviving members of the Mercer family who lived in the Savannah area. So basically from Mamalakis, who I think was aware at that point because of family members that Johnny Mercer's papers were still in his widow's residence in California, Los Angeles area. So Mamalakis to Manners to Suttles to Ralph and myself. And Dr. Suttles suggested and encouraged, I don't know that he insisted, but he suggested that that would be a wonderful addition to what he and I were Ralph and I were trying to accomplish um, in the archives. So I began shuttling my way back and forth to Los Angeles, spending um, probably cumulatively over a period of many months, weeks, learning more about Johnny Mercer, getting to know Ginger Mercer, his widow. Um, Her companion at that point was a guy named Mark Kramer, who had been a movie actor, actually, in Hollywood earlier in his life. He was already up in years by this time, approximately the same age as Ginger Mercer was. And she was probably in her 70s, either late 60s or early 70s at the time I first met her. Johnny had died about 4 or 5 years earlier. He died in 76, probably 5 years earlier. So, in consultation with Dr. Suttles, Ralph, and others, we convinced Ginger Mercer to donate Johnny Mercer's papers to Georgia State. And I went through his studio. They had a compound with their house, and then his studio was a separate building. So I went through that very carefully to try to identify materials that I thought were of significance. They weren't, frankly, all that well organized. I think Mercer tended to create his music sort of extemporaneously. Many of his songs were sort of on the back of cocktail napkins or otherwise. He just, when the inspiration struck him, he wrote down, and primarily a lyricist, of course, and an amazing wordsmith, I think as good or better than any others who have ever lived in terms of the ability to create popular music lyrics. But there were large amounts of original manuscripts of his writings, and then a whole host of other items. He would write poems or doggerel for Christmas cards, for example. So we brought those back to Georgia State, and they're part of the collection. He had received a number of Grammys and 4 Academy Awards, and we were able to bring some of those back from California to Georgia State. So it was a wonderful kind of opportunity to get to know her, to get to know the family, and to get to know the wonderful artistry that he represented. Pretty much coincident with each of these things, this would have been around 82 or so, we decided that to call what we had, the archives, the Southern Labor Archives and University Archives, wasn't very accurately descriptive of what we were doing with the addition of the music collection. So I suggested, and Ralph approved, and the university approved, the renaming of the Southern Labor Archives, retaining that title for the labor materials, to call it Special Collections, or the Special Collections Department. And so that occurred all about the same time, roughly the same time. Let's see here. Any follow-up questions, or where might I talk? What I talk about next?
I was going to have you talk a little bit more, and this kind of goes in line with the expansion. How was Special Collections and Archives viewed and supported by your library administration at the time?
Well, I think in a sense, what has happened to special collections over the 50 years speaks well to that issue, that the library leadership, and more specifically for me, Ralph and Carolyn, were tremendously supportive. You know, I would have, if they would have said, go take that hill, I would have done it. I mean, I was prepared to do whatever necessary for them to feel good about what we were trying to accomplish. And so they just had a style, an approach to management, which was not heavy-handed at all, but rather encouraging accomplishment. And for me, it worked splendidly. I felt as if I could not let them down, that if they sent me to California to get the Mercer papers, that not doing that was unacceptable. And of course, if Ginger Mercer had been different than she was, perhaps it would have been impossible. But I was prepared to do whatever it took to build the department. And then eventually, especially with the arrival of the music collection, it was important, because I was hardly a music expert, to get someone who had a specific background with music. And so Chris Payton came on board. We were able to recruit her from Wayne State University in Detroit, where I eventually ended up. And she had written her master's thesis on the musical genre, the polka. A bit different from Johnny Mercer's work, but she was very, very knowledgeable about music, and of course, the polka being another sort of popular genre, if you wish, was very well suited to building that collection. And so it eventually led us to WSB, the preeminent, for many decades, the preeminent radio station in Atlanta, and the acquisition of their music library, and then many other, we had Wayne, what is Wayne's last name? I'm blanking on it right now. We had a faculty member of the university that really was really an expert, high-level expert at country music. So we began to acquire country music materials. Christina, are you there? Christina?
Les, are you, can you hear me? Are you there?
Yes.
Yeah,
I'm
can you
here.
hear me?
Yeah,
Okay.
I can hear you.
Okay, so I think where you were at was talking about Chris Payton's role and expanding the, kind of beyond the Mercer materials.
Right, right. And of course, WSB was one of the first acquisitions to acquire materials from them, basically their music library, if you wish. Then we had faculty members with an interest in popular music, including, and I'm blanking on his last name, who was an expert on country music. Wayne. And I can't remember his last name. Still there?
Daniels?
Yes, Wayne Daniels.
Yeah, Les, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me? I think you're fading in and out. Christina? You still there?
Yeah. Oh, now I hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. I've lost your video.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. So I think you were referring to Wayne Daniels.
Yes,
Was the faculty member who had a background in country music?
that's correct.
Okay.
So we added documentation around that genre of music. And then I know you've done much more, you and other heads of special collections and music archivists have added other materials, including the Atlanta um, Symphony Collection and others, which I'm delighted to see. Are you still there? Christina?
Okay. Okay. I don't know why I'm dropping out. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can't see you. I've lost
Les,
video.
can you hear me?
I can. Okay, you're back.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure why it's dropping in and out.
I'm not sure either. I've got high-speed internet here, and um, it could be on my end, and I just don't know it. Um, Although I think we have pretty good service here, but I don't know.
I think I might turn off my video just to see if it helps. But if you want to pick up where you left off about Wayne Daniels.
Sure. Uh, well, we acquired various materials, sheet music, etc., that he had accumulated over the years, and added that as sort of a subgenre of the popular music collection. Do you want me to go on?
So I think we were, I mean, you were talking about being supported by the library, but then I think did we move on to department priorities and how they changed?
I think that was the next topic um,
Yeah.
on the list that you gave me in advance. Although I don't think I've ever really talked. I don't think in this interview I've talked about what GSU was like when I arrived and for the first few years.
Yeah, do you want to go back and tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Um, some of this you may already be aware of, but just to reiterate my understanding and my experience with what GSU was like, it was, of course, a much smaller institution. I guess you have, the university has, what, 50,000 students now? It was more like maybe a third of that or thereabouts uh, when I first arrived, 15 to 20,000, somewhere in that neighborhood, I think. And was almost entirely or very heavily a commuter institution with a significantly older than average student population, um, which had an effect on the nature of the institution. Um, it also had a very compact campus, um, much, much smaller than it has become in recent years. Do I still have you? Christina? Christina?
Yes. Can you hear me, Les?
I can now, yeah. Trouble is, I don't know when you're on and when you're not. And I don't know what of what I just said you heard. I mean,
I'm here.
it's definitely um, breaking up from time to time. Did you hear me talking about the
Yeah,
university?
and I don't know. Yeah. So what I heard was that when you were there, it was primarily a commuter college with an older student population and maybe somewhere between, I think you said 12 and 20,000 students.
I think it was probably 15 to 20, but in that range, and of course it varied some from time to time. One of the interesting sidelights to that was that when the economy slowed down, uh, uh, GSU's uh, enrollment tended to go up. Um, when the economy was more boisterous, uh, our enrollment might fade a bit because um, young people or people early in their careers, if they couldn't find the kind of job that they wanted, uh, often would come back to Georgia State to complete a degree or to upgrade their credentials. Um, so it was sort of anti-cyclical kind of enrollment, and I suppose that had implications for the university's sort of fiscal uh, health as well.
So, did that did that have any impact on special collections operations? And as you talk about this, and not having the traditional sort of 4-year cycle for a lot of these students, do you think that that had any impact?
I think it may have, although not very direct. For example, I think it often took students because they were, and that a factor I didn't actually explicitly mention. I think Georgia State also had a significantly larger contingent of part-time students than might be the case now, or was the case at more traditional academic institutions. So people would work maybe full-time and still go to school part-time. So that was much more common. Now, in terms of implications for us, I suppose the only one I can think of readily was that, let's say, graduate students who would be likely the more likely to be users of our resources would be around for longer. They would often have to have jobs to maintain themselves and their families, and would uh, be, let's say, take 2, 3, 4 years to receive a master's degree, and possibly longer than that for a doctorate. So I don't know whether that had really much of an impact on the archives, but it may have had some. Are you there? Hello? Christina? Christina? Christina, are you there? Hello?
Les, can you hear me?
You just kicked back in. You'd been offline for, I don't know, a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I'm trying to find out. I don't know why all of a sudden my internet dropped out, but now it's come back and I've been getting a full signal most of this time, so it could just be the kids pulling on the signal with their schoolwork.
Yeah. Well, I think I have figured out how I can tell whether you're hearing me or not.
Okay.
Because, excuse me, because when you're on, your name appears and then Morna's name appears. I think when you drop your connection, I mean, when your connection is dropped.
Hmm.
So I think I can now, because, you know, if I don't hear you, Morna's name is up on the screen.
Okay. Um,
And I don't
okay.
know whether you heard everything I just said or not.
So I think the last thing that I caught was that, let's see, we talked about commuter college, not traditional, and
Well, I was talking about the fact that
oh, and part-time.
part-time, yes,
Mhm.
much greater percentage of, and I'm sure that's still true to some degree, maybe at Georgia State, but I think it was true even more in the time that I was there, that there were large numbers of both undergraduates and graduates. And of course, since the users of archival materials are more likely to be graduate students, that may have had some impact, but very limited impact on use of the archives or that sort of thing. I suppose it might have enabled us to get student assistance more readily because many of them would have to be supporting themselves in addition to going to school.
True. And we still have a pretty good flow of student assistants coming in because they need to
Right,
work.
right, right.
So I think let's go back to the department priorities and how they maybe changed while you were there and what your priorities were.
Okay. Well, as I think I mentioned earlier, growing the collections was my initial largest priority. Uh, as we began to broaden the thematic structure of the department with music and then eventually photographs and so forth, um, I also sought, and with the help of the library, was able to grow the sort of professional contingent uh, within the department. Beginning with Chris, I mentioned that. Um, and so increasing professional personnel with specialized expertise was another very high priority. I was, of course, always interested in um, encouraging research usage of the collections. I knew that that would be one significant measure of our success. And so that's another reason that I tried to maintain a very close working relationship with the history department because uh, obviously their graduate students especially were among the more likely um, to actually use the collections. It's another reason why we did things like the labor history conferences to make scholars that were many of whom were interested in Southern labor history, to make them aware of what we were trying to accomplish, the new collections we had received, and so forth. Um, and then outreach to constituents was an extremely important part of what I was doing at the time and what we as a department were trying to do. And that included labor and popular music. And of course, those constituencies increased and were more enriched as we became better known, had richer collections, um, had more professionals devoted to um, the work of the department and so forth. there's a factor I didn't mention that I think was also significant in terms of the ability to gain support from both the library and from the university more generally. And that was that I thought it important that that leading by example, that we were involved, we, the professionals in the Special Collections Department, were involved in both library governance and university governance. So as soon as I could manage, I sought election to the University Senate, Faculty Senate, happened to be elected, and eventually served for several years on the executive committee of the University Senate. And one of the key advantages there was that it gave me a face-to-face opportunity on, I think it was a monthly basis, at least during the academic year, to face-to-face meetings with top university leadership, specifically Dr. Langdale and Dr. Suttles. So I was able to establish and then hopefully develop in a positive way a relationship with the top university leadership. I think it may have been one of the reasons why Dr. Suttles approached us to establish the music collection through the Mercer connection, of course. So I considered that very, very important. And then within the library, are you still there?
Les,
Yes.
are you there? I see your video is gone, but are you audio?
Yeah, I'm
Oh,
here,
there's your video.
but
Can you hear me? You can hear me?
I can hear you. Morna came on a couple of minutes ago. I don't know
Okay.
exactly how long. And I'm not sure what you heard and what you didn't.
I didn't hear Morna. Is she having an internet connection problem on her end?
Well, it's just that periodically, of course, I don't have video of you. Periodically, your name disappears and Morna's comes on my screen. Her name, not her video.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that may be an indication that somehow you're dropping off. And like I say, I don't hear her or see her, but somehow I must lose you periodically. I was, of course, talking about being involved with university and library governance, and I'm not sure how much you heard.
So again, the last thing I heard was expanding the professional staffing for areas, and then I think about theirs when it dropped out.
Okay. Well, I then talked about university and library governance. Did you hear any of that?
No, I didn't hear any of that.
Okay. Well, I, in sort of looking, scanning the horizon of special collections at the university and within the library, I thought it extremely important and a great opportunity to become as involved as I could in both university governance and library governance. And for the university, that meant seeking and then successfully establishing my membership on the University Senate, and then eventually on the Senate Executive Committee. As I recall, the University Senate only met like once a semester, or once a quarter maybe, because I think we were still on the quarter system at that point. But the possibility of being elected to the executive committee of the Senate offered itself, and I sought that and was elected. So that gave me face-to-face exposure to top university leadership. So I think the meetings were maybe once a month or something on that order. So these were sit-down meetings with maybe half a dozen or so representative university faculty, and Dr. Suttles and Dr. Langdale. And so it was a great opportunity to get to know them, get to know what they valued, to over time have a chance to share with them what we were trying to accomplish in the library and special collections. And I think was a key to their having faith in us and as needed, giving us additional resources, basically giving them to Ralph so he could allocate them to special collections. And so I think that was absolutely crucial. And then, of course, as department head of special collections, I was on the Library Administrative Council and tried to involve myself as actively as possible in that. And then I mentioned earlier in our interview, when significant issues for library faculty presented themselves, I tried to advocate on behalf of what I thought were the best interests of library faculty, as for example, with the issue of library faculty status. So I sort of threw myself into involvement with library governance, attending the regular administrative council meetings, which were at least once a month. And so that was talking about overall university priorities, as well as, of course, where the library's priorities fit into that. And so it was a great opportunity to build relationships with both Ralph and Carolyn and with other department heads. And since I didn't have a library degree, I thought it was important that I was able to convince my library school educated colleagues that I brought value to the library and that special collections brought value to the library. So that was that. I thought that issue of governance at both the university and library levels, and I carried it in the library so far as to be involved in things like the library's volleyball team, to hopefully sort of build esprit de corps with special collections being an active, involved part of overall library activities, including extracurricular activities. And then the library was also undergoing during this period, with the emergence of OCLC and online library cataloging and the like, was also involved in getting rid of the card catalog. And so I would volunteer along with other library faculty to actually pull library cards as online records were created for parts of the library collection. Just another example of trying to be a part in as active a sense as possible of the overall library's activities.
So Ralph, I want to skip the next question for a second because the following two questions you've touched on a bit already in our conversation, but did you have anything further to say about the evolution of the department, and such as positions, growth, or structural changes?
Well, I actually have a list of all those members of the department that were added that I can recall. And I apologize in advance to any I might not remember right off the top, since I have no documentation of any kind. But I've already mentioned Chris Patton as curator of the Popular Music Collection. During my time there, we added Laurel Bowen, who was curator of the university archives and also eventually took on responsibility for advocating, at least, if not more than that, the issue of library preservation of library materials was also added to her portfolio while she was, after she was hired. Of course, you know Peter Roberts, who retired just recently, who was originally hired, as best I recall, to work on our photographic collections. He had a degree in, I think, fine arts, and so had some background, not specifically, I think, with photographic archives, but some pertinent experience with graphic materials that I thought suited him for that. And also a very able person. Do you know Annie Tilden?
Yes, I'm interviewing Annie in a couple weeks.
Okay, okay. Annie Tilden, also a dear friend like Peter. And Annie was added to help us with an increasing backlog of labor materials as we were adding, actually over time, thousands of cubic feet of labor materials. I was well aware that we did not have the resources to process that material on a timely basis. So we actually received a National Endowment for the Humanities grant to help us with that. And then Annie was added as a person to help us with that. Eventually, Joe Constance, has that name come to your attention?
Yes, I do recall his name.
Joe Constance was hired, and I think his major area of activity had to do with rare books. And then Ellen Garrison, has that name come up?
I don't recognize that name.
Okay. Actually, I think more recently she may have another, I think that may be the last name of her first husband, and she may have remarried and may go by another name. I've lost track, frankly. Her name at the time was Ellen Garrison, and actually hired her for sort of the proto women's collection. We didn't have a formal women's collection at that point, but I wanted her to work on such collections as the nurses' collections. And then we had a relatively small collection called the National Domestic Workers Collection. Wanted her to work on materials that primarily spoke to the experience of women in the workplace. I think she was only with us for a relatively short time, but her name occurred to me in reviewing my recollections for the period that I was there. And then I would be negligent if I did not mention Cliff Kuhn, the late and very much missed Cliff Kuhn. It was Cliff's idea to create the Georgia Government Oral History Program. And of course, when that began, he was actually not yet, hadn't finished his dissertation, so he was not yet on the history faculty, which he eventually came to be a mainstay of. But it was his idea to start that Georgia Government Oral History Program. So as of sometime in the 80s, I don't recall exactly when, we were able to interview, he was able to interview all then living governors of Georgia, for example. And I think in some cases it may be the only interviews, formal oral history interviews that were ever conducted with some of these people. I'm not, if Cliff were around, he would know, and I don't recall for sure. So those were some of the people that I was able to bring on board, and I think it was because of trying to demonstrate value to the university and to the library that we were given the resources to be able to hire the people that I just mentioned.
And I think you already did cover new collecting areas added by describing those folks and their roles, but is there anything that you feel like we've missed?
Well, you're back on video, by the way.
Yes. So hopefully my connection is stable.
Nice to see you. Well, I would only mention in connection with the photograph collections, that it was, of course, the Lane brothers. Well, of course, we had already acquired thousands of photographs from out of labor collections and out of university collections. So we already had a photograph collection, but the existence of it as a sort of separate freestanding collection occurred during my time there. Starting with the Lane brothers, that, as I understand it, were probably the preeminent photographic studio, commercial photographic studio in the Atlanta area for decades. And then Tracy O'Neill, who was both, I guess, at various times associated with the Lane brothers on his own and working for the Journal-Constitution. So we were able to add both of both the Lane brothers and Tracy O'Neill's materials. And we began discussion with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution regarding adding their photo morgue. Those negotiations did not end until after I left. And then I would only mention the Media Center, which for a time we were in charge of, and whose offices were on the 8th floor, or no, I'm sorry, the 7th floor of the library south. And then I think that, I'm not sure, is there a media center now? Have I lost you?
No, there is no media center. Can you hear me,
Yeah,
Les?
I lost
Okay.
video, but I can see you.
Yeah, there's
I
no
can hear you.
media center. Yeah, so there's no media center. So now we have what we call the Curve, and that is very different from sort of the media centers of the past. It is more for data visualization and gaming, game creation, and it's very I don't know, very much virtual and high tech, a little beyond my knowledge and expertise.
I've seen it, having visited the department a couple of times, and it's really extraordinary. And I also probably would be lost there initially, at least. I might just add, with regard to the Lane brothers and Tracy O'Neill collections, that we were able to get university support to purchase those collections. They were not free. And as best I recall, I think in both cases, we were able to convince with the help of Dr. Suttles, Ralph and Dr. Suttles, able to convince the university's foundation to fund those two acquisitions.
Okay.
And then we were also able, I've mentioned earlier, just in general, exhibits. The Mercer uh, exhibit, which was originally there on the 8th floor of Library South, I think was also paid for with University Foundation monies. And let me just share one brief, I think, but colorful anecdote. It was a wonderful experience opening that exhibit. There was a Mercer concert in the outer area there. I think you know where I'm talking about. As you walk into Special Collections, that open area with now the reading room off to the right, which was once the Mercer exhibit.
Yeah, I believe you're talking about the gallery space, the exhibit gallery space.
Exactly. That's where the first Mercer concert was held. And it was sort of a soiree kind of experience. Ginger was dressed to the nines with Mark Kramer, her Hollywood boyfriend, with her. And it just went off splendid. It was a very magical moment. And of course, live musicians performing Mercer music. Earlier that week, we had finished the Mercer exhibit, and Dr. Suttles and Kay Crouch, I'm not sure that name is familiar at all. I think she had been Dean of Women, and I'm actually not sure. She was a vice president of the university at the time, and to my knowledge, the first and at that time only female vice president. Dr. Suttles and Kay Crouch, Dr. Kay Crouch, Vice President Kay Crouch, came up to get a preview of the Mercer exhibit. And I remember so vividly, this was not at the concert, this was prior to the concert, but just a few days earlier. I remember Dr. Suttles and Kay Crouch dancing in the, and if you had known either one of them, it would be very improbable. You know, a Baptist minister and this rather, I don't know, formal Southern woman dancing sort of spontaneously in the middle of the Mercer exhibit. It was one of those special moments when you knew, you know, you had succeeded, ka-ching, because it was really a very special place and a very special time to be there. Follow-up questions? Christina?
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I didn't realize I was on mute. I think that leads into this question about where were you getting materials and collections, and who were your donor base? You've touched a little bit on this again earlier in the interview, but if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. Well, the labor collections came almost entirely from either trade union offices spread around the South, and then eventually, to some degree, beyond, and from individual labor union officials. And then, as I had said earlier, we also sought to document what in many cases were not formal labor unions, let's say like nurses associations, for example. Although some is, in more recent years, some nurses associations do collective bargaining and function as trade unions, even if they don't call themselves that. And then individual labor union officials, people who had once worked in the labor movement and were now retired, or like Bill Ussery had moved into government service or otherwise. So almost all of those came either directly or indirectly from individual labor leaders. And then, of course, the Mercer collection clearly came from Ginger Mercer. And then WSB was the source of that material. And then the photograph collections, as I mentioned earlier, initially came by purchase. And then I really don't know, you might be able to answer this. I don't think Special Collections bought the AJC collection, did they? I assume that was donated or not. Christina?
Yeah, so I caught part of that. What you were asking if what was donated or bought?
Well, I was just curious whether the AJC collection was donated or purchased or some combination thereof.
I know that Tracy O'Neill was purchased. I thought that Lane was not, but it's possible that it was also purchased.
Well, I know it was
Oh, you know, okay.
because
So I'm,
I presided over that purchase. I was only interested because I know that Lane and O'Neill were purchased. I was just curious as to what the arrangement with AJC, although we were
oh,
negotiating a donation when I was there. There were too many questions about access and so on that I could not end up resolving before I left.
it was donated. I will simply say, since this is being recorded, that it was probably not the best arrangement in terms of how that collection is co-managed.
Yeah,
It's a lot of work on our end.
right. And I'm not surprised by that because uh, that was their position when I was there, is they wanted us to do a lot of work. And I was, of course, trying to negotiate to relatively minimize that. Um, but be that as it may. Um, I think the next question that you had posed had to do with major events or momentous occasions when I worked at Special Collections. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I know you mentioned a few, but if you have others that come to mind.
Yes, and I won't belabor any of these, but the move to Alumni Hall was, as I said earlier, was critical because we were running totally out of space. And initially, well, in fact, I haven't talked at all about compact shelving. We to postpone the need for additional space, we had compact shelving installed on the 10th floor of the Urban Life building. And I'm not sure whether you are aware of this or not, but at some point, a structural engineer was touring our facilities or something and identified that we probably shouldn't. And, you know, I had been told by the vendor of this compact shelving that it was perfectly safe to put compact shelving on that 10th floor level of that building. The structural engineer questioned that. And so, as it turned out, ironically, it may have motivated the university to move us to a basement level because there were questions. We certainly never heard any groaning of the building or anything else, but there were questions at the time, and I had relied on the vendor who said that it was perfectly safe, and supposedly had talked to a structural engineer about that issue. So we moved to Alumni Hall out of necessity, I feel like. And not very long thereafter, after moving the collections and staff and everything else to the lowest floor of Alumni Hall, with Mr. Ussery's help, financial help, we opened the Friends of Honest Labor exhibit in the outer area there at the bottom of the spiral staircase within that building. And we had a celebration at the same time, because we were off-site. We were off-site. At that point, we still had some materials in Urban Life, as I remember. Eventually, that was all moved out. But we had to shuttle materials back and forth, and Mr. Ussery was kind enough to present us with a new minivan for that purpose, and also to pick up collections in the from around the South and the country. So that was a really very nice celebration of both the exhibit and of the gift of that vehicle. The opening of special collections in Library South may be worth mentioning that Ralph was kind enough to allow me to help design that space. So I guess whatever credit or blame there is for the layout of that building, of that level of the building. And not that I did it all by myself. We worked with architects and Ralph and whatever. But I guess I really had sort of lead responsibility for planning that space.
Well, and it's in a little bit different configuration, I believe, than it was originally when you moved into that space.
I think so. I think so. And the last time I was there, it was lovely. Then I already mentioned the opening of the Mercer exhibit in Library South and Mercer concerts. And that initial concert was not the only one we had. We had several, including over in the auditorium in the music building, which I assume is still there. I really don't know. So we had a series of those, I think maybe 3 or so over the course of the time I was there. And of course, there have been several since. And actually that was part of the agreement with the Mercer Foundation to provide financial support for the Mercer collection and popular music collection, was to at least periodically have concerts of Mercer music at Georgia State. And I think the university has been faithful in carrying out that that stipulation in the, and I haven't actually seen whatever the formal agreement was, but there was certainly an agreement in principle that Mercer concerts would continue to take place. I already mentioned the millionth volume to the library and Wealth of Nations. I also mentioned the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we also received, I can't remember how many, but at least one Georgia Humanities Council grant as well. And then major financial donations were received, of course, from Ussery, the Mercer Foundation, the GSU Foundation, and then the Labor Awards Committee and Workman's Circle provided a few $1,000s a year for many, many years to the labor archives. Follow-up questions?
So I think that covers it. And you did, the next question, you talked quite a bit about already in terms of what the space was like and what the moves and space reorganization is. Do you have anything additional to add to that?
I don't think so. Of course, we gradually installed more movable shelving in order to maximize the use of the space. And since it was on ground level, there was no longer the concern about the structural integrity of that space, although the problems you've been encountering recently in terms of water dangers may have been increased by being on the lowest level of the alumni hall. I think I don't really have anything to add to that unless you have a follow-up question. The next question I
No,
have,
but
I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, there's one question that we skipped over a little earlier, if you wouldn't mind,
Not at all.
if you could speak to your greatest accomplishment, what you think your greatest accomplishment was.
Uh, that's a really hard question. Well, I think building the department, taking it from a pretty small very limited resource department and very limited collections department to something quite a lot more than that. And the whether we were ever able to staff it as fully as we would like to have. For example, I would like to have had some more processing archivists to see to the arrangement and description of collections more quickly than we were able to do. So there were, if you wish, shortcomings in terms of what I would have ideally liked in a perfect universe, but I feel like we made major progress for the department in terms of growing both the scale of what was done and hopefully over, the long-term future, over the significance that those materials will have to our understanding the past. So that's a pretty general thing. Otherwise, I think building the relationship with Bill Ussery was important, even though it actually didn't fully realize all that either he or I would have wished. I really haven't mentioned in this interview the building that we hope to build for special collections. And we felt like at one point, or a couple of different points, as if that might have been a realistic possibility. Ussery paid to have an architect engaged, architectural drawings were made, even a model of the building was made. Does that still exist, by the way?
Yes, we still have it.
Oh, cool, cool. So that was sort of an unrealized hope. And I think the key factor, as I see it, in that not being achieved was that about in the few years before I left Special Collections, university leadership turned over several times. Dr. Langdale retired as president, and Dr. Suttles was in place for, I think, as I remember it, 2 or 3 years before he retired. Then John Palms, later the president of the University of South Carolina, came, but for only a very brief period. And then Sherman Day took over. And I think had either Suttles or John Palms continued for a longer period of time, I think we might have had some chance at getting that building built. Because at the time, Bill Ussery was prepared, or said he was at least, and I think he was prepared to give it every possible effort to raise at least $10 million. That was sort of the rough target that we identified. as necessary to at least provide the bulk of the funding, not necessarily all of it, but the bulk of the funding for that building. So we had, I think it's fair to say, or at least from my perspective, we had the support of Dr. Suttles for that project. And later, I think I was able to convince John Palms of the value to the university of doing that. But what we weren't able to go forward far enough while they were in place for it to actually happen. I might just make one other comment about Ussery and whether that would have potentially been a achievable objective. Ussery at that point was still very actively involved in his consulting work with a fair portion of the Fortune 50 or something. I mean, of the very top corporations, both in the United States and elsewhere, including Toyota, for example, and other major companies. So it is not, I don't think it was a pipe dream to hope that 10 million or more could have been raised for that purpose, but you had to have a confluence of university support and Ussery's confidence in that support for that to happen. And as from Ussery's perspective, as the sort of revolving door, and I'm not being critical of either Suttles or Palms or anyone else, but as Ussery saw it, the sort of revolving door of university leadership was not appropriate and not helpful in him feeling confident in putting basically his lifetime reputation on the line for such a project. If things had been different, I think in university leadership, it could have been a different outcome. Follow-up question?
I was going to say, I think that makes a good segue into what challenges you faced and how you were able to overcome them.
Okay. Well, as with every archivist I've ever known, space was always at a premium. Now, that's actually not true in the sense that I assume the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library is adding very little to its collection, given the time that has passed since President Roosevelt was in office. So there are some archives that have pretty much fixed collections, more or less. So that's actually not true of every archives, but a lot that have active collecting programs, at least, are short of space. So I think it was all interconnected, the sort of university governance issues and library governance issues, the addition of various collections and the sort of recognition that they received, like Mercer, enabled us to make a persuasive argument that we needed more space. Things like having a Mercer exhibit, clearly that was not possible or not practical had we not moved into Library South. There was really no place in Alumni Hall. I suppose theoretically you could have had one out in that outer public area, but they were basically looking for a new dedicated space. And so we really needed to move into Library South and had the support of Ralph and others to make that happen. Budget and personnel are always issues, and ones that undoubtedly exist in your time as well. Um, I'm not sure there's much more that I can say. The way we were successful in gaining more budget and more personnel was because of all the things I've talked about that we were able to accomplish. I've already mentioned transitory leadership of the university, which was not true in the first few years that I worked there, but eventually was certainly true. And then the very beginnings of information technology for special collections and for the library as a whole. I don't think we encountered the same problems with information technology that you and others of more recent years face in terms of scanning and online access to materials, social media as means of making known what you're doing and so forth. So you have many more challenges in that arena than I ever had, but at the same time, I knew very much less than you do. So just trying to begin to use computers and using sources like OCLC and the cataloging of manuscript collections online, which were just in the very beginnings stages when I was in archival work, were significant challenges, even though what we were trying to accomplish was very primitive in terms of more recent times.
Beyond that, the next question is very similar. Were there anything, thinking a little more broadly, other challenges that just generally special collections and archives faced, or do you feel like you covered that?
I think probably I covered that. There are the inevitable challenges of growth. How are you going to organize materials, personnel, lines of command and control? I mean, the sort of routine organizational issues existed and exist in any organization, but none of them were insurmountable. I think for the most part, we had very good kind of esprit de corps among the archivists, some more than others, of course, as is always the case. But I think for the most part, we worked effectively together. I did delegate a lot. I had confidence in people like Bob and Chris and others, Peter, Laurel, etc., that they knew what they were doing and were doing it, even if I was away in Los Angeles or wherever. But I think to the extent you can, that's the way an organization should be run, is by delegating responsibility and then obviously monitoring how that is working over time to see whether the objectives you've set out are being met.
So I think the next question that I have is asking about what Georgia State's campus was like. And by that, I'm looking to see if you could describe a little more about the physical campus and sort of, the size, the buildings, what you experienced while you were on campus.
Well, it was not called the concrete campus for no reason. It was quite compact. Basically, Kell Hall, and I think when I first arrived, was the closest building to the immediate 5 Points Central City Park area. I don't think there was any university presence on or even right by the Central City Park. That was it. Of course, obviously, Library South did not exist when I arrived. As best I remember it, there were either some temporary buildings or parking lots in that footprint. The business administration building was there already. Obviously, that new research building over there closer to the state capitol was not there, obviously. The physical education building where the gymnasium was there, but the physical education complex across Piedmont Avenue wasn't there. Urban Life was there, obviously. But Alumni Hall, when I first arrived, Alumni Hall was the city auditorium. Didn't belong to Georgia State, hadn't been repurposed for that, for university purposes, was on the upper level of a large auditorium, large part of which was torn down. And then, the whole building, what was left of it, was repurposed. And what had been the huge auditorium just turned into a driveway and parking beyond. So, and then I'm trying to think on the other perimeter. Sparks Hall was obviously there. And I understand Kell Hall is no more. So, you could basically count the number of buildings on one hand, pretty much. And now, I don't know what multiples of that it is. And it's really fascinating that many of those buildings existed when I was first there. The Trust Company Bank building, for example. And then lots and lots of others. The dorms, of course, had not yet been built along Piedmont Avenue there and so forth. So it was just a hugely smaller campus. And of course, there were virtually no real green areas, just a few shrubs here and there. So again, the concrete campus characterization was on the spot.
Yeah, and we're just getting our first green areas now.
Yes, that's what I understand. I haven't seen them, but yes, I've heard that. And it's a little hard to imagine not having that two-level structure, parking below and walkway above, but, I'm sure it's being done for good reason.
Yeah, I'll be excited to see it when it's finished.
Right.
So were there women in leadership roles? And by that, within the library, as well as you mentioned earlier, one of the vice presidents was one of the few women, but can you talk a little bit about women in leadership roles at that time?
Sure. To my knowledge, Kay Crouch was the only university official at the vice presidential level who was female. Now, I'd have to go back and try to, it's possible that Sparks or Kell or one of the other people had a woman in a position of high responsibility, but that would be way before my time too. It was very much a patriarchal, at the highest levels, it was a patriarchal environment, to be honest, to be forthright about it. Of course, Carolyn Robison was the number 2 person in the library, and I think I'm being accurate in saying that I think a majority of department heads within the library were female. Uh, I know the head of reference was, uh, the head of circulation was. I think it was actually, to be perfectly honest, it was probably more or less an even split between female and male at the departmental level for much of the time I was there. The person who had been head of acquisitions left, retired, I think. The person that had been head of cataloging, who had been a woman, left, and I think a male took her place. So it was sort of a changing cast of characters over those 15 years, with, I'd say, rough equivalence in terms of numbers of men and women in leadership posts. And of course, once I began the hiring process, being responsible for the hiring process, beyond Bob Dinwiddie, Faye, and myself. Of course, Faye eventually left. But I think this is true, that the first two professionals I hired, Chris and Laurel, are obviously women. And then it was beyond that, it was sort of a mixture. Ellen Garrison, and so forth. And then Joe Constance, obviously male, Annie Tilden, Cliff Kuhn. So it was sort of a mixed picture after that as far as gender and personnel within the department.
So moving on to the next question, this is going back to more collections, what was the most unique item that you worked with while you were at Georgia State?
Well, I mean, that's really a hard question. Blues in the manuscript of Blues in the Night, Johnny's hands, in Johnny's hand, and he struck out certain lines. My mom had done told me, I think, moved from down in the song to the top of the song. I mean, some things like that are iconic parts of American culture, I feel. So that's one option, would be Johnny Mercer's lyrics were magical. And what about his Academy Awards? I mean, how many archives have one of those? Not that many, probably. So that would be one answer. But in terms of what I think is sort of recapturing the past most magically to me, was that, and of course, I think you're aware that we've received over the years, Special Collections, Labor Archives, has received a huge amount of material from the Machinists Union that, of course, were founded in Atlanta. We got a donation of materials from them that included a banner that you would carry in a parade. As I remember it, it's bright red, has the machinist symbol on it. I don't know whether you're familiar with that, but it's like a gear and so forth. And I think across it is something like San Francisco Lodge number, and I don't know the number, which by itself is pretty amazing. I mean, I love banners. You probably have never seen, there's a labor archives in the UK. I'm trying to remember whether it's in Manchester. I visited it, but it's been a long, long time ago. I don't think it's in Manchester, but it's somewhere there in central England. And it's a labor archives for the UK. And among the other things they have are this large number of banners, of labor banners. And when you walk into the place, the walls were covered with these banners, and very dramatic. Well, getting back to the machinist banner, um, later on, we got sort of the photo morgue, if you wish, of the machinist union, several thousand photographs of the machinist union. And I can't remember who discovered it. It probably was Bob, but it may have been Peter, discovered a photo taken of the machinist banner in a parade in the ruins of San Francisco after the great San Francisco earthquake of I think it was 1906, if I remember correctly. So we have not only this photograph that shows machinists parading around the ruins of San Francisco, but we've actually got the banner that is in that photo. And to me, that's sort of magical. It sort of, it evokes that time, that very special time, arguably the worst earthquake ever suffered in the United States. And of course, the machinists and their pride in their work and the achievement of their union. So to me, that's arguably the most magical materials in the collection. I would only highlight one more possibility, and that is all these amazing things from the Ussery collection, including all the appointments by presidents he received, and pictures of him with presidents and so forth. So it's amazing to think the high honors, high national honors, which he received and which we are able to document through the labor archives.
So I think that leads really well into what was your favorite collection?
Well, I've already probably, not surprisingly, already referred to them, the Ussery papers and the distinction that Bill Ussery achieved in his lifetime. Obviously, the Mercer collection and the iconic cultural distinction that Mercer achieved in his lifetime. And then I think I mentioned to you in previous conversations we've had that photo collections are especially near and dear to my heart. I think they evoke the past more effectively than just about any medium, any type of documentation. And so I was so thrilled to get the collections of the Lane brothers, Tracy O'Neill, and that since then the AJC materials and others have come into the archives. And I don't think I've mentioned it, but how delighted I am at the women's collection and the other collections, bringing, it seems to me, the story of, if I can call it American reform, American trying to make a better America, bringing that up to date with gender equality, with the equality of those of various sexual orientations and so forth. That I'm just delighted that the Special Collections has taken those steps to sort of round out the picture of how America has sought to perfect itself in terms of recognizing wide varieties of people as very legitimate Americans.
So I think we're just about done, but do you have your most memorable story from Georgia State? Do you have something that really sticks in your head?
Well, it's very hard to pin it down. I've already talked about bringing the Mercer papers from Los Angeles. I don't know that I need to. I mean, it's amazing, uh, but I don't think I need to comment further unless you have questions. Opening of the Mercer exhibit, I've also talked about that, how special that few days was. Ginger Mercer traveling to Atlanta, the Mercer concert, the opening of the Mercer exhibit. Um, all of that was very, very special time. And of course, it was all in this brand new space that we had just moved into, uh, overlooking downtown Atlanta. I mean, uh, of your own knowledge, you know how special that space is in terms of its outlook and so forth. So I don't need to know that I need to expand on that, but I do want to refer to a couple of what I thought were really extraordinary adventures involving bringing labor materials to Georgia State. One of those was convincing Bill Ussery to give his papers. I had been cultivating a relationship with him for a few years at this point. This is the early 80s, or maybe around 1980 approximately. But he had been reluctant to actually ship off his papers. So he had a very close confidant in his office. The term may have been used at that time. She was his secretary, but she was much more than that. And I had a verbal commitment from Bill Ussery to give his papers. So she let me take them. And he would tease me for years thereafter that you came and stole my papers, not meaning it seriously, of course. But in fact, his commitment to the special collections and labor archives actually strengthened over time. But at first, he was a bit reluctant. And by the way, his office at that time was in downtown Washington, right across the street from the church, a Catholic church, obviously, where John F. Kennedy's funeral had been held many, many years before, of course, in the early 60s. So that was always a special place for me because of the regard I had for JFK and so on. Just an aside. But let me mention two others, and I'll try to keep it quick. The United Textile Workers was a smaller textile union in the textile industry, having probably, I don't know the exact numbers, but just a few tens of thousands of members. So what was called the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union was much larger. But, and their records, as I remember, were already, I actually can't remember offhand where they were deposited, but that was not a possibility. I think maybe they were at Cornell, but I'm not sure of that. But the United Textile Workers had not donated their papers to any repository. So Bob Dinwiddie and I flew up to New York, which is where they were headquartered, and loaded up a giant U-Haul truck. Their offices were in a old, somewhat run-down building on Lower Broadway, north of Wall Street, but not by much. And among the events that took place, we were warned by some truck. We parked the truck and were loading it. a trucker, a kindly trucker, warned us that some guys were coming toward the truck seeking to spray paint it, which I'm sure the truck rental company would not have appreciated. So we were able to uh, sort of move toward them, and they moved away so that truck didn't get spray painted. But the most fascinating thing was that after we left the offices, this huge U-Haul truck full to the brim, um, this was during one of the fuel shortages. You're too young to remember, I think, when there were like odd even days when you could buy gas at all, or many filling stations didn't have any fuel. So we departed New York City, headed for Atlanta, the full truck of United Textile Workers materials, and had to very carefully proceed because we were constantly in danger of running out of gas. We would stop at some service stations. They would not have any fuel, or I think there was an odd even number system at that point. We had an odd when you needed an even or something. So we proceeded very gingerly down the New Jersey Turnpike, into Pennsylvania, eventually into Virginia, and so on. It took us like several days to get back because we were in danger of running out of fuel the whole time. So that was one of those acquisitions adventures that I remember fondly, and I appreciate Bob's helping me with making that happen. And then finally, I would mention the air traffic controllers collection. And of course, your predecessor, or not your predecessor, Tracy Drummond, the previous Southern Labor Archives person, has written an article about this, about the acquisition of the air traffic controllers collection. But I can't remember that she actually gave the sort of most colorful part of it. She does mention that a former air traffic controller named Terrence Shannon obtained permission by seeking it from a court judge in, I don't know whether it was the DC Circuit Court or which court exactly, but he had a letter from this judge saying that he, as a former controller, could take custody of the air traffic controller's materials. I don't know whether you know any of the history of that dispute.
I only know sort of a cursory history of that dispute based on my family being airline pilots.
Oh, okay. Well, there's a big backstory, including Reagan's getting endorsed by them in 1980 and then turning around and firing all of them. But the more pertinent part of the story is that when the controllers union refused to go back to work, of course, Reagan fired them all. And then the courts exacted large fines on them for each day they remained on strike, eventually bankrupting them totally. And so the court seized all their assets, the furniture in their offices, of course, all of their papers, all their records, the Newsweek magazines that have been on the tables in their entryway and whatever, I mean, everything. And it was stored in it probably, I'm sure that there had to be access to it during the court proceedings, which eventually resulted in the air traffic controllers organization going out of business forever. There's actually a successor union that has arisen. But so the court seized all these documents and everything else, and they ended up in a semi-trailer truck near National Airport in DC. So Terry Shannon and I flew up to DC, again, rented a huge truck, and flew up early in the morning of a day and spent a full day excavating that tractor trailer truck trailer and trying to identify which documents in it were worth saving. There were many documents, printouts of no consequence or whatever that we didn't retrieve, but and which I assume are gone. But it's just as well, because I think I erred on the side of caution of things that I thought had any plausible reason to save. Of course, it was a very quick process. It had to be a very quick process, just a matter of hours. Filled up to the brim this largest U-Haul truck and headed back toward Atlanta. And of course, it got to be very late at night, middle of the night, before we finally got to North Carolina from DC again. And we came to a way station and went into the way station like all good trucks are supposed to do, and were overweight. In other words, we had loaded way more paper in the back of that truck than was allowed due to the limits, legal limits on that particular vehicle. Well, initially, the people came out and threatened to impound the truck and said we'd have to return it by rail car to Atlanta. I was able to talk them out of that, and fortunately had enough money on me to pay a fine. I don't remember the amount. So we proceeded from someplace in central North Carolina to Atlanta by back roads. We finally stopped somewhere in South Carolina and spent what was left of the night, there wasn't much, and then drove on the next day into Atlanta. But I only mention these stories to just illustrate how, what improbable situations one can get in as an archivist. And I could tell many more, but those I think are two of the most important, or most interesting, let me put it that way.
Yeah, we certainly do get ourselves into some unique situations,
You bet, you bet.
especially with acquisitions.
Right, right.
So my last question for you is, where did you go after Georgia State? What was your career like following Georgia State?
Yeah, I left, excuse me, I started at Georgia State at age 30, left Georgia State at age 45, and really hated to leave Georgia State because I'd really come of age. I felt like I had come of age there, the kind of developments we've been talking about today. But what was offered me was, in a sense, the being made Pope. I'm being facetious, of course, but if you were a labor archivist, being head of the Walter Reuther Library in Detroit was the papacy and was the ultimate pinnacle of achievement, because it was clearly the largest, most richly documented, I mean, they had things like Cesar Chavez's papers and, of course, Walter Reuther's, obviously, and on and on. I mean, those are just a couple of examples. They had their own dedicated building, which, of course, I had hoped we could have in Atlanta. So when they offered me the job, it was an offer I couldn't refuse, to use the common term. So I spent 5 years at Wayne State as head of the Reuther Library. It was a good 5 years. Detroit is a much different place than Atlanta. My wife didn't like it as well, but we had a good experience there, and it was certainly a great experience. I got to meet Cesar Chavez before his death, which was a very special, for me, a very special occasion, and got to work closely with, and these names probably won't mean anything to you, but with Doug Fraser, for example, was a former president of the United Auto Workers and had been very, very close to and worked closely with Reuther and others. Got to know just a number of really, really interesting, important people. And of course, Detroit, if Atlanta isn't the capital of the civil rights movement, maybe Detroit is. So I got to meet any number of amazing civil rights figures, including Rosa Parks, for example. So it was a very special experience. Then, of course, I came back to Georgia State, as you probably know, to head up an effort that Bill Ussery and I made to form an Ussery Center for the Workplace. And at least initially, it seemed to go well, but it was basically, we had to try to be pretty much self-sustaining, and that was difficult, very, very difficult. And so eventually, as again, I think you're probably aware, the center was closed and I left. And I actually spent the last 10 years of my career fundraising for nonprofits, which was an interesting life experience in itself. So that, and then I've been retired for the last 3 years. So that's my life story, more or less.
Well, thank you, Les. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add that we didn't cover in this interview?
Not really, not unless you have other questions. I think I did mention in previous conversation that I wrote a brief history of the Southern Labor Archives at Tracy's request 8 years ago. And it gives a tiny bit of detail that I didn't actually have recorded more recently, like when the special collections moved into Alumni Hall and when we moved into Library South, but I'm sure you already have that information. I'd be glad to share this if you don't have access to it. I also have some other publications that I'd be glad to share if you don't have them on hand, if they're available.